So we're going to talk about how shall I live knowing I will die. And if you don't already have the book, it's How Shall We Live? How Then Shall We Live by Wayne Muller. So please get the book if you don't have it. It's one to keep in your library. I've had mine for quite a few years and I love it. How many of you have thought about dying? Given a lot of thought to it. Well, there are a few people. How many of you don't think about dying? A few. And especially younger people, right? It's not a big deal. I'm going to be here for a while. Why worry? Well, there was a woman who had a heart attack. And she ended up in the hospital, and she had a near-death experience. It was a major heart attack. And in that experience, God appeared to her and told her, it's not your time. You're going to have 30 more years of life. So, knowing she had 30 more years and she wasn't focusing on death at all, she decided to stay in the hospital, have a facelift, a tummy tuck, eyebrow lift, liposuctions, just recreate herself so she could be even better in the next 30 years. And then when she was released from the hospital a month later, she walked outside the hospital and got run over by an ambulance speeding by. She died, she went to heaven, and she is upset. She had been promised that she had 30 years, and God reneged on his promise. So she said, God, how could you do this to me? He said, I didn't even recognize you. So how shall I live knowing I will die? Is the external more important? Is it important that I look a certain way? So when my friends see me laid out, they can say, like we often say, where I come from, they really put her away nicely. They did a good job. She's laying there with her reading glasses on and her Bible on her chest. Good job. She looked so natural. But how shall we live knowing we will die? There was a gentleman, and this will relate to all of us right now at this time of the year, who was on his deathbed in the hospital. And he called for his best friend, Bill. Bill, I need you to come and be by my side. And when Bill arrived, he said, lean in close. I don't want my family to hear this. I want to be cremated. And I want you to take care of that for me, Bill. We've been best friends for years. Please do me that favor. I don't care what they say. Have me cremated. He says, sure, Fred, I'll do that for you. He said, well, what do you want me to do with your ashes? He said, put them in an envelope, address it to the IRS, and on the outside of the envelope, right now, you've got everything. So, how shall we live knowing we will die? So I want to talk about that this morning in light of scripture from Matthew. And it's Matthew, the 6th chapter, the 28th verse. And when in Matthew and in Mark and Luke and John, Jesus is giving instructions to the disciples. Charles Fillmore, co-founder of Unity, said, the Bible is our textbook, not to be taken literally word for word, but interpreted to your level of understanding, metaphysically. So in Matthew 6:28, the verse talks about the lilies of the field. He says, why worry about what you will eat, what you will drink, or what you will wear? Look at the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor spin. They don't worry about what to eat or how they look. And yet, not even Solomon in all of his glory is clothed in such beauty. Look at the lilies of the field. We do a lot of worrying between our birth and our final days. We worry about whether we are showing up the way we want to be, whether people are treating us well, whether we're loved, whether we're liked. Do we have enough? Are we enough? And what Jesus is saying to the disciples is, don't worry about any of that. Don't worry about any of that. He goes on to say, let your light shine, because you are the light of the world. You are, and I mean you, are the light of the world. So when we think about how shall we live knowing we will die, that's simple. Let your light shine. Now, in letting your light shine, there may be people who say, oh, you know, she puts on too much, or, you know, I don't really care for her. I don't like all those shoes. I don't like the way she looks, you know, her hair. She should dye it. It's getting gray. But that's not about my light. My light is to show up, to help light the way for someone else who may be in darkness. Letting your light shine is how to live, knowing you will die. My grandfather was a sage. And I'm so grateful that as a young girl, I was able to spend quality time with him in this little rural red dust town of Strong, Arkansas, on the Louisiana border. And Grandpa Charlie Roberts would often say things that I didn't understand. For example, Bob White. Now, I thought Bob White was really a person that the birds were calling for years. And it's a whippoorwill. But Bob White sounds much nicer. Doesn't sound, I can identify with that. So he broke things down to where I could understand. And he said something very profound that ties into Wayne Muller's thesis, how then shall I live, knowing I will die? Grandpa said, we are all graveyard travelers. We are all graveyard travelers. Whether we like it or not, we're headed in the same direction, and none of us will get out of here alive. Not in this body. There is something bigger than this. How then shall I live, knowing I will die? In Ecclesiastes, the seventh chapter, the first through the second verse, we read, a good name is better than the day of birth, and the day of birth better than the day, and the day of death better than the day of birth. A good name is better than the day of birth, and the day of death better than the day of birth. Why is that? How can you say that the end of someone's life is better than the day that they were born? When we're born, we cry, and the world rejoices. When we die, everyone else cries, and we rejoice. Scripture says we then know that we have fought the good fight. We have run the good race. We've achieved what we were here to be. Last week, Duke talked about, who am I? Who am I? How do I define myself? How do I show up to be the light of the world? And next week, he'll talk about, what do I love? What am I here to be? What do I love? So how do I show up who the I am is in me? And how do I demonstrate that I am in the years between my birth and my death? Linda Ellis describes that in her poem, The Dash. She calls the years between the birth and the death, that dash line that you see on obituaries. She calls those the most important years to define who you are and what you're called to be. So what does this mean to live your dash? What does it mean? Things happen in our lives that cause us to regroup. As GPS tells us to detour, to turn around, recalculate. I had a life-changing experience I've shared with you before, and I was only 29 years old, and I'd never heard the C word, cancer. And when I was diagnosed with cervical cancer, I didn't know what to do with that. And for a long time, it just rang in my ear. It sounded like a train. I couldn't hear anything but this roaring noise. And I guess that's part of the state of shock when you get that kind of news. We had 2 small children. I didn't know what the next steps would be. But what I did know is if this was not my time to go, I was going to put as much living into my life in my dash that I could. That's when I made up my mind that someday I wanted to use my life experiences as an inspiration for other people. Dr. Martin Luther King asked the question that we should ask ourselves: what am I doing for others? How does my dash serve you? How can I take my mess and turn it into a message that might light the way for someone else? How can I turn my test into a testimony? And so I was looking at some people in history, more recent history, who demonstrated this as Jesus taught. And how Wayne Muller is explaining, how then shall we live knowing we will die? If you already know the end result, you've already begun, as Stephen Covey says, with the end in mind. You know what's coming. You don't know when or how, but you know what's coming. Then your job, since you have no control over that, is to live your life to the fullest that you can. Make every moment count. Be present where you are. So I looked up this guru, I'm sure you know, Steve Paul Jobs. He was 56 years old when pancreatic cancer ended his life. You know him as the co-founder of Apple Computer. He once said that he always had a feeling that he was going to die young. He always had that feeling. Maybe that's what inspired him to do great things while he was living. Things that changed the world through technology. He chose to live his life to the fullest. He gave some advice before he passed away about how to live knowing you're going to die. He certainly knew his end was near. He was brave enough to share these thoughts to an audience at Stanford University when he had lost his hair and he was frail. He said, the more we can be ourselves, the more fulfilled our lives would be. Isn't that what Duke talked about last week? Who am I? Who am I? Not who other people say I am or think I am. Who am I? He says, don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, he said, have the courage to follow your heart and your intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. What was he saying? Knowing that he was going to die, he would devote his time to following the guidance of that inner voice that's always speaking to all of us. And sometimes we think we've got more time, and we don't listen. So Steve Jobs and Dr. King had a lot in common. Dr. King was not diagnosed with a terminal illness that took his life. But Dr. King said in one of his last messages, like anybody, I'd love to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. Now, the will of Spirit for us is to live our lives to the best of our abilities. Jesus said, I came that they may have life and have it more abundantly. That means put everything you've got into living. Tim McGraw, the country western singer, explained how to live knowing we will die in his song, Live Like You're Dying. David Adams sings that so well. He said he was talking to someone in their early 40s with a lot of life before him, and one moment came that stopped him on a dime. He said he spent most of the next days looking at x-rays, talking about the options and talking about sweet times. I asked him when it sank in that this might really be the real end, how's it hit you when you get that kind of news? Man, what did you do? He said, I went skydiving. I went Rocky Mountain climbing. I went 2.2 on a bull named Fu Manchu. And I loved deeper, and I spoke sweeter, and I gave forgiveness I'd been denying. And he said, someday, I hope you get the chance to live like you're dying. When I think about the summary of this chapter, how then shall I live knowing I will die? Tim McGraw put it very simply. Live like you are dying. Another song that David sings by Daniel Nahmod is another one to remember about living like you're dying. If this was my last song, if this was my final day, if tomorrow I'll be gone, what do I want to say? If this is my last song, if it's my time to go, when my body's moved on, what will I have to show? Not the fortune or the fame. They scatter to the wind. The things that make a name just don't matter in the end. Is the world a little more peaceful? Oceans and sky a little more blue? Is humankind a little bit nicer about the good that we can do? Does the sun shine a little brighter where before there was only rain? If so, then I'm glad I came. I'm glad I came. We need to leave here with the feeling that we're glad we were here. Because as it says in the book of Esther, we were all born for such a time as this. If there's anything you don't like about what's going on in your life, in the community, in your nation, in the world, you were born for such a time as this. There is something for you to do while you still have that dash. There is a work for you to live like you are dying. There's so much going on in our lives right now, and it's so easy to try to shut the world out, close our minds, harden our hearts, but that's not living. That's not living. Stephen de Grelais is one of my favorite poets, and he wrote something I dearly love. I keep it in front of me on my refrigerator, my mirror. I shall pass through this way but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, or any kindness I can show to any fellow creature, let me do it now. Let me not defer nor neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. So if we live our lives knowing that this dash is short, it only lasts a short time, what do we fill it with that we're doing for others? So that when the time comes and we meet that day, and we have done all that we can do, we leave behind something beautiful. We made the world better than it was when we came. Oops, sorry folks. My father, you've heard me say this before, sang a song to me the night before he was killed. And of course, we didn't know that that was going to happen. I was 25. And it was, if I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can tell some traveler that he's going wrong, then my living will not be in vain. My living will not be in vain. That's how we should live, knowing we will die. There will be opportunities the remainder of this day when you walk out of here all week, and many will show up on your doorstep to let you live your dash to the fullest, knowing how you should live, being kind, being loving, being gentle, being understanding, being patient with people you may not even know or understand. Because guess what? We're all going to end up in the same direction. It may not appear that way on the outside. They're not like me. They don't look like me. They don't act like me. But we're all graveyard travelers. And the thing to do now is to live knowing you will die. Live like you are dying. Jesus said, I came that they may have life, not death, that they may have life and have it more abundantly. Are you living your life? Not what someone else expects you to be or do. Are you fulfilling your dreams? That's the intent of this message. What are you doing? You cannot love others if you don't love yourself. So how are you loving yourself? So I asked the question I started with. Who in here is afraid to die? Who in here is afraid to live? Right. Some of us are, because we haven't yet understood who we are and what we're called to be. We are children of the living, loving God, the God in us. And when we know that with all of our heart, nothing can stop us from living a life of abundance. That's not about material things. So I want to clarify that right now. We're not talking about materialistic things. We're talking about things that money can't buy, wealth can't buy, fame can't buy, beauty can't buy. We're talking about that inner love and strength that only you can tap into from within yourself. We're talking about that new name that we talked about on the White Stone service. Who are you? What are you called to be? How will you live knowing you will die? Think about that as we move into meditation.